I'm going to start by removing the wheel, 21mm socket, take all 5 of your lug nuts off, and then remove the wheel. Now that the wheel's off, let's remove this bolt that holds the brake hose in place, 12mm socket. There we go. Now with a 17mm socket, let's remove this bolt here, which is also your slider pin. Obviously this is in very poor condition here. Take this out. I've never seen one this rotted, but we'll clean this up. At this point, this caliper is pretty stuck on here, so what I'm going to do is try to get in here with my small pry bar and just compress the piston a little bit. That'll give me a little bit of movement back and forth, and hopefully this lets go of the pads. There we go. Pry this up. Make sure this hose is still unattached. Flip it up and then slide it off of this top slider here. There's no bolt at the top, it just slides off. Take it and set it aside out of your way. Now we can remove the brake pads. Now let's take off these two 14mm bolts that hold the bracket onto the knuckle. It's going to be a little tough to get in here. You'll need to find whatever tools you have that fit. For me, it's this 3/8 extension with this specific 3/8 socket. Let's try to remove this bolt. Perfect. Came out. My socket's stuck though, but that's whatever. Leave that in there for now because it's kind of stuck, and let's move to the bottom. Now take this out and watch out because it's going to want to fall. Catch it, remove your socket and the bolt. Here's your caliper bracket, set that aside. Now remove the rotor. Mine's actually coming free, but if yours is not, it's probably because it's seized onto the hub, unless you have your parking brake applied, in which case take that off. But if it's seized on the hub, just hammer right in between the studs. That should break it free. Now let's clean up this hub surface. You can use a wire brush and just scrape it basically if yours isn't too rusted. Mine is a little bit more rusted than I'd like for the wire brush, so I'm going to use a little sanding disc and clean everything up. That way the rotor has a nice flat surface to mount on. Let's apply some anti-seize on this. Try not to get it on the parking brake shoes as much as possible. If you do happen to get any on them, we'll just clean it up. I'm going to put this rotor on backwards, that way it can sit here for me so I can clean up the surface. It's coated in oil from the factory, that way it doesn't rust when it's just sitting on the shelf. So spray it with some brake parts cleaner and wipe it off. And don't forget about this inner surface where your parking brake shoes ride. It's also coated in oil, and if you leave it like that, they won't grab, so you'll have no parking brake. Okay, now flip it over and put it on the right way. And you want to do the same thing to this outer surface. Clean it up. Spray it with brake parts cleaner. Take a rag and just wipe it off. And now we can get ready to clean up the bracket and install that. Onto the caliper bracket, I want to remove these pieces of hardware here, the spring retainers, and pop these off so I can clean underneath them. There we go. This bracket is pretty rusted, so a wire brush is not going to do the trick, but if yours just has some surface rust, obviously you can wire brush it. For me, I'm going to use well, it's a cutting disc, so be careful if you use this, but basically you want to sand this down. Be very gentle when you do this. Now that this is clean on both sides, let's apply a little bit of grease. A very thin layer is all you need. You don't want a lot because otherwise it'll squish out and get onto the rotor here in the middle. You want just enough to prevent rust from building up. There we go. We'll do this on both sides. All right, so take your new anti-rattle clips, these spring retainers here, and put them down with the bent hook on the outside. The flat tab goes towards the center, and then you have a taller part and a shorter part that follows the curve of the caliper bracket. So just make sure they're going the right way. Oops. Press them down all the way. Make sure they seat in there properly. If they don't, probably means you didn't clean up the bracket. well enough. Let's see. It's important that you have the flat tab towards the inside, because the curved one will actually contact the rotor if you put it backwards. So make sure that you have the right one. And that's the other side. There we go. Press them down all the way. And now what I want to do next is actually remove this pin. If it wasn't so rusted for me, I wouldn't worry about it, but I'm going to take this boot off, and as you can see, there's some buildup of stuff in here. So I'm going to take this pin off with an 8mm Allen head, and then that way I can clean it very well as in this groove here. Okay, there it is. I'm going to take this over to my wire wheel. If you don't have a wire wheel, just use a brush or whatever you have. But basically you want to clean up this area here, clean off the old grease, clean up the rust. That way this boot can seal up properly and not cause any issues in the future. I cleaned this pin up on my wire wheel and it's ready to go on. I put a little bit of thread locker on those threads. That way it can stay in there nice and tight. Drive it back in, make sure it's tight. To clean up this boot on the inside, you can spray a little bit of brake parts cleaner on a rag and then push the rag through, pull it out the other side, and when you get the rag in where the brake parts cleaner was sprayed, kind of squish it and twist it around. That's going to rub all the grease off of the boot and onto the rag and clean it up. Make sure it stays expanded like that. That way it can get inside of that ridge. There you go. Pretty dirty on the inside, as you can see. Now it's clean, so let's slide it back on. Make sure it's going the right way. The smaller part went on this lip here. Before I put it on all the way, I'm going to add some grease on there. That's going to help it seal up. And the reason I didn't grease up the whole pin is because the grease would have gotten wiped off as I put this boot on. So now we can grease the pin. You don't need a ton. You can actually pack some right into that boot there if you would like to. But basically coat it all around. That way the caliper has a nice smooth area to slide on. Now we can get ready to install this on the vehicle. As you can see, this new rotor has a hole in it, and that's normal. This is actually for you to stick a screwdriver in and adjust your parking brake shoes without taking anything apart, which is great. But you do have to cover it, and there's a cover on your old rotor. And if you don't cover it, water gets in there, it rusts things out, and then you need to service your brakes sooner than expected. So take this cover off and reuse it on the new one. Now let's get the caliper bracket back onto the rotor. Start that on. There we go. And move up to the top. Start this one on as well. I'm going to snug these up and then torque them to 34 foot-pounds. 34 foot-pounds. That's one. Second one. Let's put the pads in. I'm going to start with the outer one. It slides on nice and easy. If it doesn't, that means you didn't clean up the bracket enough and the pad's actually getting squished. So you'll have braking issues because when you release the brakes, it won't come off the rotor. For the inner pad, you want to put this wear indicator on, and I'm going to put it on the top of the inner pad. And that's because as the rotor turns forward, I want it to grab onto this little tab and make a squealing noise. The way you put this on is, well, you just put it onto here. It's got a little mark on each side depending on which side this pad is for. So press it on all the way. And the reason I put on the inner pad is because that's where the piston is. So if for some reason your caliper gets seized up and can't slide anymore, your inner pad will wear out first, and that's when you know you'll need brakes. So now that these are on, let's get the caliper prepared. Now we have to push in this piston. Before I push this in, I'm just going to wipe off the debris that's around it. Sometimes a lot builds up, and if you push it in like that, it actually goes into this dust seal and causes issues. Now I'm going to get my caliper depression tool, and they make different types, and if you don't have any of them, you can just use a large C-clamp or pliers or whatever you have. But basically, you just want to go slow, push this piston in to retract it to make room for the new pads. Again, you want to go slow. That's the key to this. You don't want anything to get damaged. And once it bottoms out, which is right here, you can release your tool. So now I'm actually going to take a rag and some brake parts cleaner and clean in here. I'm going to wet that down, take my rag, and I just want to wipe off the old grease that was in there from the old slider. You can use a bore brush if you'd like. There we go. And I also want to clean this ridge up with my wire brush. That way the boot can have a nice area to seal up against. It's not going to be perfect. This caliper's in pretty poor condition, but it'll do the job. And if I grease it up enough, it will make a nice tight seal. So I'm actually going to apply some grease right now. There we go. Make sure it's all the way around. The grease, like I said, will ensure that it seals up. I'm going to put a little bit of extra grease in here. And a couple more areas to grease up is the surface or the outer ring of this piston and these two ears. Putting grease on these two areas is going to help the pads operate quietly and smoothly. You don't need a lot. Okay, slide the caliper on and then over. Set it down, and let's grab the bolt that mounts it on the bottom. And it was in pretty poor condition, so I cleaned it up. I did the best I could on the wire brush. It's not perfect. Honestly, I would suggest replacing it if yours looks like this, but I don't have a new one right now, so I'm just going to grease this one up, and it should do the trick. Grease this up. Try not to get it on the threads. You want grease on this shanked area. This is the slider part of this bolt. And I'm going to put just a little bit of extra grease in the boot here. Work this into the boot. Slide the pin in, and once you push it through all the way, make sure this boot is seated properly, which for me it wasn't. Okay, once this boot is seated all the way, you can thread in the slider pin / bolt. Let's snug it up and torque it to 20 foot-pounds. Perfect. And now the brake hose with the 12mm bolt goes right here. Put that on. And let's snug this up. Let's get the wheel on. Put on all 5 of your lug nuts, bottom them out, and torque them to 76 foot-pounds. 76 foot-pounds. Perfect.